The auction block was made of splintered wood, and it smelled like fear. Down below, the crowd was a blur of dusty hats and cruel smiles. Men who'd bid on cattle just moments before were now turning their eyes to the woman on the platform. My mother, Sarah. She stood there straight as a board, but I could feel her trembling. My sisters, the twins, were hiding behind her skirt. I was supposed to be the brave one, the little man of the family, but my legs felt like jelly. I was 3 years old. What could I do? A big man with a face like a slab of raw meat stepped forward. His name was Hank Baraman, and his voice was like gravel grinding together. "This woman's husband owed me $1,000, he boomed, his voice echoing across the square. "Lost it at the card table, then had the nerve to drop dead. So now she and her spawn are my property." He pointed a thick finger at us. "I intend to work 'em till the debt is paid." My mother's voice was a whisper, but it cut through the noise. "They're just children. Please, don't take them." Baraman just laughed. It was a horrible sound. He nodded to one of his men, a brute with arms like tree trunks. The brute grabbed my arm, yanking me forward. I screamed. My sisters shrieked, their little hands clutching at Mama's dress. She fought. Oh, she fought. She sank to her knees, trying to hold on to us, but they were too strong. They tore my sisters from her grasp, then ripped me away too. She fell to the planks, her hands clutching at the empty air where we had been. She crawled toward Baraman, sobbing, begging. His boot shot out and caught her in the side. A gasp of pain, and she rolled away, blood blooming at the corner of her mouth. The crowd laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. A merchant spat on the ground near her. This was our world now, a stage for other people's amusement, and just when all hope seemed to drain out of the dusty air, a man stepped out from the shadows. He was tall, lean, and moved with a quiet purpose that made the whole square go silent. He wore a worn leather coat the color of the earth, and his face was all angles and shadows, carved by sun and wind. He walked right up to the platform and placed a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the wood. He didn't look at my mother. He didn't look at us. He looked right at Hank Baraman. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "I'll pay the debt, for her and for the children." A ripple of disbelief went through the crowd. Someone snickered. "Think you got that kind of money, stranger? That coat of yours says otherwise." Baraman glared, his eyes narrowed to slits. $500 by sunrise tomorrow, not a cent less." The tall man didn't flinch. He reached into his coat. For a second, I thought he was pulling out a gun. The whole crowd held its breath. But what he pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a simple silver necklace, with a small locket that glinted in the harsh sunlight. He laid it gently on the table. "I don't have it all today," he said, his voice as calm as a slow-moving river. "But this belonged to my mother. I'll be back with the rest. You let them go. Now." Baraman stared at the necklace, a greasy smile spreading across his face. "You'd trade your mother's keepsake for this worthless lot? You're a bigger fool than I thought." The stranger's eyes were like chips of flint. "Then I guess I'll have to prove I'm not a fool." He turned and walked away, picking up his whiskey bottle as he went. He didn't look back once. On the platform, my mother had sobbed herself into silence. She looked from the necklace on the table to the back of the man disappearing into the crowd. For the first time all day, a tiny flicker of something that wasn't terror appeared in her eyes. It was hope, a dangerous, fragile thing in a place like this. But it was there, and it was all we had. The wagon ride was silent. Every rut in the road felt like a hammer blow. My mother held the three of us so tight I could barely breathe, her arms a desperate shield against a world that had tried to tear us apart. She stared out at the passing landscape, but her eyes weren't seeing it. They were seeing a future she couldn't control. She didn't look at the man driving the wagon. Jonas Cade. That was his name. We'd heard someone whisper it in the crowd. She was too afraid to look at him. Every man who had ever offered her help had always come to collect, taking far more than they ever gave. Finally, her voice came out, a cracked whisper. "Thank you, sir. I'll work hard. I'll do whatever you say." Jonas didn't answer. He just kept his eyes on the trail ahead, the reins loose in his weathered hands. We arrived at his cabin just as dusk was bleeding across the sky. It wasn't much. A plain log structure with a sagging porch, huddled against a line of dark pine trees. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, the only sign of life for miles. He pulled the wagon to a halt, the only sound the sigh of the wind through the tall grass. He got down without a word. Gently, one by one, he lifted us children from the wagon and carried us inside. He laid us on a single mattress by the cold stove, his touch surprisingly careful for a man so rugged. Then he turned to my mother. He handed her a tin cup of water. "You and the kids sleep here tonight," he said, his voice flat. "I'll be in the barn." And then he was gone. The door creaked shut behind him, leaving us alone in the small dark space. My mother stared at the door, her face a mask of confusion. That night she didn't sleep. She lay curled around us, listening to every creak of the old cabin, every gust of wind that howled outside. She was waiting for the sound of his footsteps on the porch, waiting for the door to open, waiting for him to demand the price for our safety, a price she'd been forced to pay too many times before. But the knock never came. The only sound was the wind, the creak of the logs, and the soft, sleeping breaths of her children. And as the hours stretched on, a new feeling began to creep in alongside the fear. It was bewilderment. He had bought her, but he wasn't claiming his property. What kind of man was this Jonas Cade, and what did he really want with us? The unknown was somehow more terrifying than the cruelty she was used to. Dawn broke, painting the dusty windows in shades of gray and pink. My mother slipped from the mattress before we even stirred. She had to prove her worth. She had to show this silent man that she wasn't a burden. She started working like a woman possessed. She found a bucket and fetched icy water from the pump out back. She scrubbed the floorboards with a rag torn from her own petticoat until her knuckles were red and raw. She found a sack of cornmeal and tried to make porridge, her hands trembling so hard she could barely hold the spoon. She was a ghost, fueled by fear. Fear that he would change his mind. Fear that he would see she was useless and send us back to Brahman. So she worked. She pushed past the pain, wrapping her bleeding hands in more rags, and kept going. The cabin door creaked open. Jonas stood there, silhouetted against the morning sun. He didn't move. He just watched her. He saw the soaked dress, the raw hands, the frantic, desperate energy. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and her quiet panic. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't angry. It was calm. Too calm. "You don't need to act like a servant," he said, his eyes unreadable. "And you don't need to bleed to prove you're worth shelter." My mother froze, the spoon hovering in midair. She turned to face him, slow and uncertain. The words she wanted to say, the questions she wanted to ask, they all got stuck in her throat. "Just take care of the children," he said. "That's all I ask." He turned and walked back outside, leaving her standing there in the middle of the room he had given her. She stared at the spot where he had been, her mind reeling. He hadn't asked for anything. He hadn't threatened her. He had simply seen her. She looked down at her torn, bleeding hands. For the first time since my father died, she looked at a man and didn't feel like prey. She didn't know if she could trust this kindness. It felt like a trap because kindness always was. But as she watched him through the window, mending a fence post with steady, silent hands, a tiny, forgotten seed of something began to sprout in the barren soil of her heart. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was curiosity. And in her world, that was a revolution. Days bled into weeks. A quiet rhythm settled over the small cabin. My mother rose with the sun, but not with the same frantic terror. She still worked, cooking and cleaning, but now it was to make a home, not to pay a debt. We children found our courage in the wide open space. We played tag around the porch. Our laughter filling the silence Jonas seemed to carry with him like a coat. I started calling him Silent Uncle, and the name stuck. He never acknowledged it, but sometimes when he thought no one was looking, a faint smile would touch the corners of his mouth. He didn't speak much, but his actions spoke volumes. He fixed the wobbly step on the porch. He patched a leak in the roof. He sanded down the splintered railing so my sisters wouldn't cut their hands. One afternoon, he spent hours carving 3 small stools, each one the perfect height for us to sit at the table. He even carved our initials into the legs. Then came the small gifts, left without fanfare. a new hook for my mother's shawl by the door, a sturdy line for drying clothes, and then one evening, a small wooden box appeared on the table. Inside was a worn ivory comb, a neatly folded cotton handkerchief, and 3 pairs of the softest wool socks, child-sized. My mother stared at them for a long time, her fingers tracing the neat stitches. She knew he had made them. That night, while mending one of my shirts, her needle paused. She looked around the small cabin, at the sturdy chairs, the patched roof, the warm socks waiting for our feet. This was more than shelter. This was care. But her peace was shattered a few days later. While sweeping under the loose floorboard near the hearth, the broom snagged on something. Curious, she pried the board up. Underneath, covered in a thick layer of dust, was a small locked metal box. It wasn't Jonas's. It was too old, too ornate. It felt like it had been hidden there for a very long time. Her heart hammered in her chest. Every corner of this new life seemed to hold a secret. She pushed the box back into its hiding place and replaced the floorboard, but she couldn't replace the unease that had settled in her heart. This quiet cabin, this silent man, they had a past, and she was suddenly terrified it was about to become her future. A few days later, a rider appeared on the horizon. It wasn't the kind of rider you expected out here. He wasn't a cowboy or a drifter. He was clean-shaven, wore a smart waistcoat, and sat on his horse with an easy confidence. He trotted right up to the cabin as if he'd been invited. My mother met him at the door, her body instinctively shielding us from view. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. A friendly smile played on his lips. "Name's Jed. I'm an old acquaintance of Jonas. Just passing through, thought I'd see how he's faring." His eyes were warm, but they were also sharp. They scanned everything. The cabin, the newly planted flowers, us children peeking from behind our mother's skirt. She was cautious, offering him a cool cup of water, but not an invitation inside. They spoke for a few minutes about the weather, the land. Jed asked strange questions. "How's the water from that creek holding up? Find any interesting colored rocks down there?" My mother just shook her head, confused. As he prepared to leave, Jed's friendly demeanor shifted. He leaned in closer, his voice low. "You be careful, ma'am. Jonas is a good man, but he's got enemies, powerful ones, men who believe he has something that belongs to them." The words hung in the air long after he was gone, a cold premonition. That night the sky broke open. Rain came down in sheets, and thunder rattled the very bones of the cabin. But the storm outside was nothing compared to the one brewing inside. My brother Jonah was burning up with fever. His skin was hot to the touch, and his breathing came in ragged, shallow gasps. My mother tried everything, cold cloths, sips of water, but the fever wouldn't break. It was getting worse. Panic, cold and sharp, began to grip her. Jonas came in from the barn soaked to the bone. He took one look at Jonah, touched his forehead, and his face went grim. He recognized this. This wasn't a normal fever. Without a word, he turned and plunged back out into the raging storm. My mother screamed his name, but he was already gone, swallowed by the wind and the rain. She stood at the door, frozen, watching the darkness. Where was he going? What did he know? An hour passed. Then two. With every crash of lightning, her hope dwindled. Then she saw him, a shadow stumbling through the rain. He burst through the door, his shirt torn, his knuckles bruised and bleeding. He was holding a bundle of damp, dark herbs. "Boil these," he gasped, shoving them into her hands. "Now." She didn't ask where he got them, or why he was hurt. She just did as he said. The cabin filled with a strange, earthy smell. All through the night, they worked together. A silent, desperate team, fighting for my brother's life. As dawn approached, the fever finally broke. Jonah was sleeping peacefully, his skin cool to the touch. My mother looked at Jonas, who was slumped in a chair, exhausted. She looked at his bruised knuckles, then at the strange herbs. He hadn't just found a remedy. He had fought for it. He had gone somewhere, to someone, in the middle of a deadly storm and taken it. This quiet, gentle man had a violence in him, a violence he had just used to save her son. And she realized Jed's warning wasn't just a passing comment. Jonas wasn't just a rancher. He was a man with a past, a past that was clearly not done with him yet. The silence in the cabin the next morning was different. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy with unspoken questions. Jonas's bruised knuckles were a testament to a fight he wouldn't talk about. My mother watched him, her heart a tangled mess of gratitude and fear. The man who'd saved her son was also a man who bled for secrets. While Jonas was out checking the fences, my mother's anxiety drove her back to the loose floorboard. She needed to know. She had to understand the world she'd been brought into. With trembling hands, she pulled out the old metal box. It was locked, but she found a small iron poker by the hearth and managed to pry the rusted hinge open. Her breath caught in her throat. Inside, there wasn't gold or jewels. It was just paper. A thick, folded document. A deed. She unfolded it carefully. It was a deed to this very land. The cabin, the creek, the 100 acres of pasture. But the name at the top wasn't Jonas Cade. The name was Thomas Miller, her husband. Her mind reeled. This was her land? Her dead husband's land? How? Why was Jonas living on it? She scanned the document, her eyes darting across the legal jargon, and then she saw it. At the bottom of the page, a second signature, listed as a partner in the purchase. Hank Berriman. It hit her like a physical blow. The debt, the auction, it was all a lie. A cruel, elaborate theater. Her husband and Berriman had been partners. They had bought this land together. Her husband must have found something valuable. Berriman had cooked up the story about the gambling debt to get her and the children out of the way. He wasn't trying to collect a debt. He was trying to steal her inheritance. He was trying to steal her land. She was sitting on the floor, the deed shaking in her hand, when Jonas walked in. He stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes falling on the open box and the paper in her hand. His face, usually a mask of calm, tightened. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "You knew," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "You knew all along." Jonas didn't deny it. He just gave a slow, deliberate nod. His eyes were full of a deep, ancient sadness. "That's why I was at the auction," he said, his voice rough. "It was never about the $500. Before my mother could process this new revelation, the sound of hoofbeats echoed outside. Not one horse, but several. They were approaching fast. Jonas's body went rigid. He moved to the window, peering out cautiously. His whole demeanor changed. The quiet rancher was gone. In his place was a soldier. "It's Travis," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Berriman's man. He brought friends." He turned to my mother, his eyes blazing with an intensity she'd never seen before. "Take the children into the root cellar. Bolt it from the inside. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." His tone left no room for argument. She scrambled to obey, herding us toward the heavy wooden door in the floor. As she pushed us down into the cool, damp darkness, she looked back. Jonas was standing by the door, and he was holding a rifle, an old worn rifle that looked like it had seen a dozen wars. It had been hidden somewhere in this small cabin, another secret she never knew existed. She slammed the cellar door shut and slid the thick iron bolt into place. We were plunged into darkness, the only sound our own terrified breathing and the muffled thud of boots on the porch above. Then a man's voice, slick with menace. "Cade, we know you're in there. Berriman wants his property. The woman, the kids, and the deed." Silence. Then Jonas's voice, cold as stone. "The only thing you'll be getting here is a grave." A gunshot exploded, deafeningly loud, right above our heads. My sisters started screaming. My mother clapped her hands over their mouths, her whole body shaking. Another shot, then another. The sound of splintering wood, a man's curse, a heavy thud on the porch. The quiet that followed was worse than the noise. We huddled together in the dark, straining to hear, to understand who was alive and who was dead. The smell of gunpowder seeped through the cracks in the floorboards. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, we heard footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, dragging across the floor above us. They stopped right over the cellar door. A soft knock. Thump. Thump. "Sarah," a voice whispered. It was Jonas, but his voice was strained, weak. "It's over. You can come out." My mother fumbled with the bolt, her hands slick with sweat. She pushed the heavy door open and climbed out, her eyes blinking against the sudden light. The cabin was a wreck. A window was shattered. There were bullet holes in the walls. Outside on the porch, one of Bahramin's men lay motionless in a pool of blood. Another was groaning, clutching a wounded leg. Travis was gone. Jonas was slumped against the wall, his rifle on the floor beside him. He was holding his side, and blood was seeping through his fingers, staining his shirt a dark, terrifying red. "He got away," Jonas grunted, pain etched on his face. "Travis. He'll go back to Bahramin. They'll be back, with more men." My mother rushed to his side, tearing strips from her dress to press against the wound. It was bad. Deep. "We have to go," she said, her voice frantic. "We have to run." Jonas shook his head, a grim smile on his lips. "No, I'm done running." He looked her straight in the eye, and in that moment, she finally saw the man he truly was. Not just a rancher, not just a savior, but a warrior who had drawn a line in the dirt. "This land," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but filled with iron, "was my father's." The confession hung in the blood-soaked air. This wasn't just about her husband's deed or Bahramin's greed. This was older, deeper. "Bahramin's father cheated my father out of this claim years ago," Jonas continued, his breath coming in ragged pants. "He ruined him. My father died a broken man. My mother, she died of a fever because we couldn't afford a doctor. All because of the Bahramins. I came back here to take back what was stolen from my family." He looked at the deed she was still clutching in her hand. "Your husband finding this place, buying it with Bahramin, that was a complication. When he died, and Bahramin put you on that block, I saw a chance to right two wrongs at once." The silver necklace. It wasn't just a keepsake. It was a symbol of everything he had lost. His mother's only beautiful thing, bought with the last of his father's honest money. My mother stared at him, the puzzle pieces of his life clicking into place. The silence, the sadness, the sudden, shocking violence. It was all part of a story that had started long before she ever arrived. A horse nickered outside. They both froze. It wasn't one of Travis's men. It was a single rider. Jonas struggled to reach for his rifle, but he was too weak. My mother stood, placing herself between him and the door, her body a fragile shield. The door creaked open. It was Jed, the friendly acquaintance. He took in the scene at a glance. The dead man on the porch, the bullet holes, Jonas bleeding on the floor. His friendly smile was gone. In its place was a look of cold, hard calculation. "Looks like I got here just in time," he said. He wasn't looking at Jonas. He was looking at my mother. "Or maybe," he added, his hand slowly moving to the pistol at his hip, "I'm a little too late." His eyes flicked to the deed in her hand. "Bahramin pays well for that piece of paper. A lot more than this place is worth." My mother's blood ran cold. He wasn't here to help. He wasn't an old friend of Jonas. He was a bounty hunter, and he had just shown his true colors. Jed's pistol was out now, leveled at my mother's chest. "The deed, ma'am, and nobody else has to get hurt." The world narrowed to the dark, round hole at the end of that barrel. Jonas was bleeding out on the floor, helpless. My sisters and I were cowering in the corner. This was it, the end of the line. Bahramin had won. But then my mother did something I'll never forget. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She looked Jed dead in the eye and she smiled. A cold, sharp, terrifying smile. "You're right," she said, her voice steady. "It is a valuable piece of paper." She held the deed up. "But you seem to think it's the only one." Jed frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" "My husband," my mother said, her voice ringing with a newfound power, "was a paranoid man. He didn't trust Bahramin. He made a copy of that deed, and he wrote a very detailed letter explaining Bahramin's entire scheme to get the gold he was sure was in that creek. He sent that copy and that letter to a U.S. Marshal in the next territory, with instructions to open it if he died unexpectedly." Jed's face went pale. "So, you can take this paper," my mother continued, her voice like ice. "You can take it back to Bahramin, and the moment you do, you become an accomplice to fraud and murder. The marshal will have warrants out for all of you before sundown. She was bluffing. Of course, she was bluffing. There was no copy. There was no letter. My father was a gambler and a drunk, not a master strategist. But the way she said it, with such absolute conviction, it was magnificent. Jed hesitated. The gun wavered for just a second. That second was all Jonas needed. With a roar of pain and effort, he launched himself off the floor, not at Jed, but at the heavy wooden table. He heaved it over, sending it crashing into Jed's legs. Jed stumbled, his shot going wild, splintering the ceiling. And in that moment of chaos, my mother acted. She didn't run. She grabbed the hot cast iron skillet from the stove and swung it with all her might, connecting with the side of Jed's head with a sickening thud. He dropped like a sack of rocks, out cold. Silence descended on the cabin once more, broken only by Jonas's ragged breathing and my mother's heavy panting. She dropped the skillet, her hands shaking uncontrollably now that the danger had passed. She looked at Jonas, then at the unconscious man on her floor. She had just lied and fought her way out of certain death. The terrified woman who had stood on that auction block was gone. A new woman stood in her place, a survivor. Jonas looked at her with something akin to awe. That was quite a story, he managed to choke out. I'm full of them, she replied, a weary but triumphant smile touching her lips. The victory was short-lived. Jonas was losing too much blood. My mother managed to get the bullet out. It was a through and through, thankfully, and she bound the wound tightly. But he was weak, drifting in and out of consciousness, his skin pale and clammy. She tied Jed up securely with rope from the barn, then spent the rest of the day turning the cabin into a fortress. She barricaded the door with furniture, loaded Jonas's rifle, and sat by the shattered window watching the trail, waiting. She knew Bahraman would come. Travis would have told him what happened, that Jonas was still alive, that they had the deed. He wouldn't send 1 or 2 men this time. He would come himself. He would bring an army. Dusk fell, painting the sky in bloody streaks of orange and purple. The world grew quiet, too quiet. Then she saw them, a line of riders, silhouetted against the dying sun. 10 of them, maybe more, and at their head a large imposing figure, Hank Bahraman. They stopped just out of rifle range, a dark, menacing line. Cade! Bahraman's voice boomed across the valley. I know you're in there. You've been a thorn in my side for too long. Give me the woman, the deed, and I might let you bleed out in peace. My mother's heart hammered against her ribs. This was an impossible fight. She was one woman, with 3 small children and a wounded man, against a dozen armed thugs. She looked over at Jonas. His eyes were open, watching her. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper came out. The floor, under my cot in the barn, a box. His eyes fluttered shut. Panic seized her. A box? What was he trying to tell her? Was it money? Another gun? She had to know. Making a decision that felt both insane and necessary, she told me to watch Jonas and to scream if he stopped breathing. Then she slipped out the back door of the cabin, keeping low, using the deepening shadows as cover. She scurried to the barn, her heart in her throat. Inside it smelled of hay and horses. She found his cot, a simple bed of straw and blankets. Frantically, she dug underneath, her hands searching in the dirt floor. Her fingers hit something hard. Wood. She pulled it out. It was a heavy iron-bound chest. It wasn't locked. She threw the lid open and stared. It wasn't money. It wasn't a gun. It was filled with sticks of dynamite, a dozen of them at least, coils of fuse, blasting caps, the tools of a saboteur, a soldier. This was what he had kept from his past. Not just a rifle, but the means to wage a one-man war. A plan, desperate and terrifying, began to form in her mind. She grabbed 2 sticks of dynamite and a length of fuse. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely function, but she worked with a grim determination. She ran back to the cabin, her mind racing. She was no soldier. She didn't know the first thing about explosives, but she knew about fire, and she knew about desperation. Back inside, she checked on Jonas. He was still breathing. She looked out the window. Barrowman and his men were getting impatient. They were starting to move forward, fanning out to surround the cabin. She had minutes, maybe seconds. She lit the fuse. The flames sputtered to life, a tiny, deadly star in the dim light. She held the dynamite in her hand, the fuse burning shorter and shorter. This was it, a gamble that would either save them or blow them all to kingdom come. She took a deep breath, ran to the shattered window, and hurled the hissing bundle of dynamite out into the darkness, toward the encroaching line of riders. "Get down!" she screamed, pulling us kids to the floor and throwing her body over us. The explosion was biblical, a deafening roar that shook the earth, followed by a flash of light that lit up the night like a second sun. The cabin walls groaned. Dirt rained down from the ceiling. Outside, horses screamed and men shouted in pain and confusion. It was chaos. Perfect, beautiful chaos. She peered over the windowsill. The attack had been broken. Several men were down. The rest were scrambling, their horses rearing and bolting. Barrowman was trying to restore order, his face a mask of fury in the flickering light of the crater she had just made in his front line. He had underestimated them. He thought he was coming for a wounded man and a helpless widow. He had no idea he was walking into a war with a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The blast had bought them time, but my mother knew it wouldn't last. Behrman was furious, but he wasn't a coward. He'd regroup. They were still trapped. She ran back to Jonas's side. His eyes were open again, clear for the first time in hours. He had heard the explosion. A faint, grim smile touched his lips. "The box," he rasped. "I found it," she said, her voice trembling. "Good," he whispered. He coughed, a racking sound that shook his whole body. "There's a place, a ravine west of here, where the creek narrows. Weaken the rock wall above it. The whole thing will come down." It was a plan, a desperate last-ditch effort. If she could trigger a landslide, she could block the trail, cut off Barrowman's approach, maybe even trap him. But it meant leaving the cabin, leaving Jonas. "I can't leave you," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "You have to," he insisted, his hand weakly gripping her arm. "Protect the children. End this." Outside, Barrowman's voice bellowed again. "You'll pay for that, you hear me? I'm going to burn that cabin to the ground with you all inside it." There was no more time. She kissed Jonas on the forehead, a quick, desperate gesture. "I'll be back," she whispered, a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. She grabbed another 2 sticks of dynamite, a long fuse and a lantern. She gathered us children, our faces pale with terror. "We are going to play a game," she said, her voice miraculously calm. "A quiet game. We have to be silent as mice." She led us out the back, into the pitch-black night. The world was a terrifying landscape of shifting shadows and strange noises. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sounded like one of Barrowman's men. She followed the sound of the creek, her guide in the darkness. We scrambled over rocks and through thorny bushes, my little sisters whimpering softly, my own heart feeling like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. Finally, we found it, a narrow ravine, just as Jonas had described. The creek rushed through the bottom, and on one side a towering wall of loose rock and shale loomed over the trail. This was the spot. With fumbling, frozen fingers, she wedged the dynamite into a deep crevice in the rock face. She set the lantern down and uncoiled the fuse, giving herself as much length as she could. She was about to light it when she heard a noise from the trail below. Voices. Barrowman's men. They were coming up the ravine, trying to circle around to the back of the cabin. Her blood turned to ice. They were going to walk right into the kill zone. She had a choice. Light the fuse now and bury them alive, becoming a killer herself. Or wait and risk them discovering her, risk them getting to the cabin and finishing off Jonas. What would you do in that moment? Would you choose mercy or survival? My mother looked down at the men moving below. Then she looked at us, her children, huddled behind a rock, our eyes wide with fear. She struck the match. The fuse caught, spitting sparks into the night. A tiny snake of fire, eating its way toward oblivion. "Run!" she screamed, grabbing my sister's hands and pulling me behind her. We scrambled up the side of the ravine, away from the trail, away from the hissing fuse. We didn't look back. We were maybe 50 yards away when the world ended for a second time that night. The explosion was a deep, guttural roar that came from the belly of the earth. It wasn't sharp and quick like the first one. It was a grinding, tearing sound. The sound of a mountain breaking apart. We fell to the ground, covering our heads as rocks and debris rained down around us. The thunderous rumble went on, a deafening cascade of stone and dirt. When the silence finally returned, it was absolute. My mother cautiously raised her head and looked back. The trail was gone. The ravine was choked with thousands of tons of rock. Where Bahramin's men had been, there was now just a mountain of rubble. She had done it. She had buried them. She had saved us. But the cost was immense. As she stood there covered in dust, her ears ringing, she started to sob. Not from relief, but from the horror of what she'd been forced to do. She had taken lives to save her own. The frontier had demanded its price, and it had taken a piece of her soul in exchange for our lives. The walk back to the cabin was a blur. My mother carried one of my sisters and half-dragged me in the other, her body moving on pure adrenaline. The woods were eerily quiet. The threat was gone, but so was the peace. She burst through the cabin door, her eyes searching wildly for Jonas. He was where she had left him, slumped against the wall. But something was wrong. His eyes were closed. He was too still. His chest wasn't rising. "No," she whispered, rushing to his side. She put her fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. She pressed her ear to his chest, listening for a heartbeat. Silence. He was gone. She had won the battle, but she had lost him. The man who had saved her, the man she had just fought a war for, was dead. The strength that had carried her through the night vanished, and she collapsed beside him, her body finally giving in to the grief and exhaustion. She wept until she had no tears left, her sobs echoing in the broken, silent cabin. We children huddled around her, our own small hands touching her shoulder, trying to offer a comfort that was impossibly out of reach. She had saved her family, but she was alone again, more alone than ever before. As the first rays of dawn crept through the shattered window, painting the scene of devastation in pale, mournful light, my mother felt a flicker of movement against her hand. She looked down. Jonas's finger had twitched. Her head snapped up. She looked at his face. Was she imagining it? His eyelids fluttered. A soft, shallow breath escaped his lips. He was alive. Barely, miraculously, impossibly alive. His pulse was a faint, thready whisper against her fingertips. But it was there. A new kind of energy, born of desperate hope, surged through her. She had to save him. She spent the next days and nights as his nurse, his guardian, his anchor to the living world. She cleaned and dressed his wound. She brewed the last of the strange herbs he had brought, forcing the bitter liquid between his lips. She bathed his feverish skin with cool water from the creek. She didn't sleep. She barely ate. She just watched and waited and prayed. On the third day, he opened his eyes. He looked at her, his gaze hazy but aware. "You came back," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "I told you I would," she said, tears of relief streaming down her face. His recovery was slow, agonizingly so. But with each passing day, a little more strength returned to him. My mother hunted for small game, foraged for edible roots, and kept them all alive with a fierceness she never knew she possessed. The broken cabin slowly started to feel like a sanctuary again, a place not of violence, but of healing. About a week later, a rider approached, but this time, there was no menace. It was the county sheriff, along with two deputies. They had heard the explosions from town and had finally ridden out to investigate. They found a scene that left them speechless. A destroyed ravine, a bullet-riddled cabin, and a woman who calmly explained how she had been defending her home and her children from a man who had tried to kill them. The sheriff listened to her story, his expression grim. He knew Hank Bahramin. He knew his reputation. When he found Jed still tied up in the barn, delirious and babbling about a letter to a U.S. Marshal, the story became undeniable. They rode out to the ravine. They didn't find any bodies, but they found enough evidence of the ambush to corroborate my mother's tale. Hank Bahramin and his men were gone, either buried under a mountain of rock or having fled the territory for good. The law, slow and clumsy as it was, had finally arrived, and it had taken her side. The sheriff officially declared the matter an act of self-defense. The land, he confirmed, was legally hers according to the deed. The nightmare was finally over. Spring arrived, not with a sudden burst, but with a gentle, hesitant touch. Wildflowers began to poke through the soil, and the trees surrounding the cabin donned a fresh coat of green. The scars on the land began to heal, and so did the scars on the people who lived there. Jonas was on his feet again, still weak, but getting stronger every day. The silence between him and my mother was no longer filled with secrets and fear. It was filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. They had been through the fire together and had come out the other side, changed forever. One sunny afternoon, they walked out to the meadow behind the cabin. The children, us kids, ran ahead. Our laughter carried on the breeze as we chased butterflies. Jonas stopped and turned to my mother. He reached into his coat pocket, the same pocket where he had once kept a silver necklace. But he didn't pull out the necklace. He pulled out her mother's hairpin, the one she had offered him so long ago. "I believe this is yours," he said softly, placing it in her palm. She looked at him, confused. "But your mother's necklace, it's still with Barrowman." "It's just a thing," Jonas said, his eyes meeting hers. "I thought it was the most important thing I had left, a memory of my mother. But I was wrong." He gently took her hand. "Memories aren't enough. You have to build new things. You have to choose to live." He looked at her, his weathered face open and honest. "Sarah," he said, her name sounding like a prayer on his lips. "I spent my life chasing ghosts, chasing revenge. But you and the children, you're the future. You taught me how to fight for a life, not just an ending." Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time, they were tears of joy. He didn't have a ring. He didn't have a preacher. But standing there under the wide-open sky, with the sun on their faces and the sound of their children laughing in the fields, he asked her to be his wife. She didn't need to answer. Her answer was in her eyes, in the way she threw her arms around his neck, in the kiss that sealed a promise made not with words but with blood and courage, and a love that had been forged in the very heart of the fire. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were a family. They had found their home, not in a place, but in each other. This story is a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't gold buried in a creek, but the strength found in a mother's heart and the courage of a man who chooses to protect rather than possess. It's a story about how, even in the dust and despair of a brutal world, hope can take root and blossom in the most unexpected ways. If their journey from the auction block to a field of wildflowers moved you, and if you believe that the strongest families are the ones we choose, then do us a favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the next story we dig up from the history of the Wild West, where love was the most dangerous and rewarding frontier of all. Thanks for listening.